At 5 minutes past 2 in the afternoon on December the 7th, 1941, in a waiting room outside the office of the United States Secretary of State, two Japanese diplomats sat with a folder of papers, patiently expecting an appointment that had already been delayed once that day. Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, the ambassador, and Saburo Kurusu, the special envoy, sent from Tokyo months earlier specifically to assist him through the final tense weeks of negotiation, had been instructed by their own government to deliver a document to Secretary Cordell Hull at exactly 1 o'clock. They were running late, delayed by their own embassy's slowness in typing up the English translation of a message far longer and more urgent than any that had passed between the two governments in years. Neither man had any idea that 7.5 time zones away, at a naval base in the territory of Hawaii, the attack their own government had ordered was already more than an hour old, underway at that very moment while they sat patiently in a government office waiting to be shown in. This is not a story about a warning that never came. It is a story about a warning that came correctly more than once, through more than one separate channel, built by more than one team of competent people doing exactly what they had been trained to do. And it still was not enough, because the people who ultimately received each piece of it were never given the one additional thing that would have let them believe what they were looking at. Every week, we take apart a moment when a war turned, the men who saw it coming, the systems built to warn them, and the gap between a correct report and a believed one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The Pacific Fleet that lay at anchor that Sunday morning had no reason, in the ordinary run of a peacetime schedule, to expect anything unusual. Sunday was a day of reduced readiness across the entire base, a day when senior officers were more likely to be found at church or on the golf course than at their post, when a significant share of each ship's normal watch complement had been given liberty ashore the night before, and when the rhythms of a Sunday morning in Honolulu, church bells, newspapers on porches, breakfast being served in the galleys of the great gray ships lined up along Battleship Row, gave no outward sign that anything at all had changed since the previous peaceful Sunday, or the one before that. By the autumn of 1941, the relationship between the United States and the Empire of Japan had been deteriorating for years, and both governments knew it. Japan had been at war in China since 1937, and its occupation of French Indochina that summer had pushed Washington to freeze Japanese assets and cut off the oil that Japan's navy and industry depended on almost entirely from imports. A country with no domestic oil reserves of its own suddenly facing the prospect of a fleet that could not sail and factories that could not run within a matter of months rather than years. Tokyo saw two paths forward: negotiate a withdrawal. It considered a national humiliation after 4 years of war already sunk into China, or seize the oil and resources of Southeast Asia by force before the embargo strangled the country's ability to fight for them at all. On November the 26th, Secretary Hull delivered what became known as the Hull Note, a proposal demanding Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina in exchange for restored trade. Japan's own Prime Minister Hideki Tojo told his cabinet it read as an ultimatum, even though the document itself carried no deadline and was marked tentative in its own language. What almost none of the men reading it in Washington knew was that Japan's carrier strike force, 6 fleet carriers escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, had already put to sea that same day, sailing from a remote anchorage in the Kuril Islands under strict radio silence, ready to be recalled if diplomacy somehow still worked, but not waiting for it to fail first before committing the fleet to open ocean. On December the 1st, at an imperial conference in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito approved the attack. The fleet was already 4 days into its crossing of the North Pacific, running a deliberately indirect route through waters merchant shipping rarely used, precisely to avoid being spotted before it reached its final launch position north of Hawaii, refueling at sea from a trailing column of tankers along a route chosen specifically because no commercial vessel had any reason to be there in early December. The United States was not blind to the danger. It had built across the preceding several years 2 entirely separate systems designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of surprise, and on the morning of December the 7th, both of them worked exactly as they were supposed to. The first system was cryptographic. American codebreakers had by the autumn of 1941 broken Japan's diplomatic cipher machine, a system the Americans called Purple, and were reading Tokyo's messages to its own embassies almost as quickly as the Japanese government itself, an achievement of cryptanalysis that ranked among the most closely guarded secrets in the entire American war effort. The intelligence produced by this effort was known inside Washington as magic, and it was treated with such secrecy that only a small handful of the most senior officials in the American government were permitted to see it, delivered in locked pouches to a short list of names and read under supervision before being taken away again. In the first days of December, magic intercepts picked up a long message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, broken by the sending clerks into 14 separate parts because of the message's length, instructing the ambassador to prepare a formal reply to the hull note. On the night of December the 6th, American cryptographers decoded the first 13 parts, and the language was unmistakably hostile, effectively ending negotiations in tone, if not yet in explicit declaration. A young Army cryptographer named Frank Rowlett was working late that night when a colonel named Otis Sattler came into his office asking urgent questions about what the message meant, whether Tokyo had ever sent anything like it before, whether the embassy staff receiving it would even be capable of processing such an unusual volume of traffic. By the time Rowlett finished answering, Sattler had become so agitated that he pulled himself to attention and said it plainly. This meant Japan was about to go to war with the United States, then ran down the corridor, decrypt in hand, to alert the head of Army intelligence. Secretary Hull himself later said that when he saw the finished decrypt, he felt the chances of avoiding war had fallen from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 1,000,000. The 14th and final part of the message, decoded the next morning, contained something even more specific, an instruction that the full document be delivered to Secretary Hull at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon Washington time, an oddly precise demand for a diplomatic note that was otherwise entirely conventional in form. Nobody in American intelligence had been told why 1 o'clock mattered, and no one in Washington had been given any reason to treat a delivery time as operationally significant rather than merely a diplomatic formality. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, reading the intercept that morning, did the arithmetic himself. 1 o'clock in Washington was early morning in Hawaii, close enough to sunrise to be worth a warning, and he moved immediately to send an alert to Pacific commanders. But normal secure communication channels to Hawaii were experiencing technical trouble that particular morning, so Marshall's warning went out instead as an ordinary commercial telegram handed to Western Union like any civilian message, routed through standard civilian relay stations rather than military channels. And it arrived in Honolulu hours after it was sent, hours after the attack had already begun, delivered by a bicycle messenger who had to navigate streets already filled with the aftermath of the raid before he ever reached his destination. The second system was electronic, and it had been watching the sky over Oahu since before dawn. The United States Army had installed a small number of experimental long-range radar sets across the Hawaiian Islands using a design called the SCR-270, developed at the Signal Corps Laboratories in New Jersey a few years earlier as part of a new nationwide aircraft warning service, is still very much in its infancy. One of these sets sat at a remote hilltop station on the north shore of Oahu called Opana Point, a mobile unit built across 4 separate trucks carrying the transmitter, the receiver, the oscilloscope, and the generator, manned that Sunday morning by 2 Army privates, Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott. Their scheduled shift was supposed to end at 7 in the morning, but the truck that would drive them to breakfast was running late, and rather than shut the set down the moment the clock struck 7, the two men kept it running so Elliot, still the less experienced operator of the pair, could get a bit more practice reading the scope. At 7:02, Elliot saw something neither of them had ever seen before, a blip larger than anything the equipment had displayed even in training exercises, indicating what Lockhart would later describe under oath as the largest number of planes he had ever picked up on the equipment in his life. They tried to raise the temporary information center at Fort Shafter, and it took roughly 13 minutes of a poor, repeatedly dropped phone connection before they finally reached anyone at all willing to take the report seriously. The man who eventually answered was a first lieutenant named Kermit Tyler, a fighter pilot on what was, by his own later account, only his second ever shift working at the information center, and a man who had received almost no formal training in how to interpret a raw radar plot rather than simply fly an aircraft. Tyler had one piece of context in his head that morning that the privates at Opana did not have. He knew a flight of American B-17 bombers was due in from the mainland that same morning on a well-publicized ferry route, and he had noticed Hawaiian music playing continuously and unusually late on the car radio during his drive-in, a signal he had once been told in passing that stateside pilots sometimes used to home in on the islands by ear across the last stretch of open ocean. He listened to Lockhart's description of an unusually large formation approaching from almost the same compass bearing the mainland flights would use, weighed it against the two facts already sitting in his head, and told the men at Opana not to worry about it. Shortly afterward, their relief crew finally arrived, and Lockhart and Elliot left the station for the breakfast they had been waiting for since 7 o'clock. They continued plotting the formation on their own initiative for several more minutes after the call, until contact was finally lost around 7:40, and they did not learn what the blip had actually been until they had already sat down to eat. Both systems, the cryptographic and the electronic, had done exactly what they were built to do. Purple had been broken, an achievement that would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war for decades after it ended. The message had been read hours before the attack, its language correctly understood by the handful of men cleared to see it as the end of diplomacy. The radar had detected the incoming Japanese formation a full 3/4 of an hour before it reached its target, tracked continuously for most of that time by two attentive privates who had no obligation to still be at their post at all, and reported up the chain within minutes of first contact rather than sat on or ignored. At almost every individual link in both chains, a person did their job competently and on time, exactly as their training and their orders required of them. What neither system had, anywhere along its length, was a single person in that specific chair on that specific morning with both the authority and the context to connect a decoded diplomatic threat 6,000 miles away to a radar blip on an island in the middle of the Pacific, and conclude in the space of a few seconds that both were describing the same attack arriving from the same direction at the same hour. At 7:48 in the morning, Hawaii time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, more than 180 fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers launched from 6 carriers, steaming under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, roughly 200 miles north of Oahu, began its attack on the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet moored along Battleship Row. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the strike from the air, radioed back to the fleet the now famous code words, confirming complete surprise had been achieved, a message that told Nagumo, still holding his carriers at launch position hundreds of miles away, that the entire operation had gone exactly as planned. Below the incoming aircraft, sailors were still asleep on a Sunday morning, Church services had been scheduled aboard several ships within the hour. Anti-aircraft guns stood largely unmanned across the anchorage, and ammunition for many of the fleet's weapons was locked away in secure storage, rather than kept ready at the gun mounts, a peacetime precaution nobody had thought urgent enough to reverse. Pearl Harbor's commanders had, in the weeks before the attack, spent far more of their attention worrying about local sabotage from Japanese sympathizers on the islands than about a naval airstrike launch from beyond the horizon, and aircraft on the surrounding airfields, Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows among them, had been parked wingtip to wingtip in tight, orderly rows, specifically to make them easier for a limited number of guards to watch overnight against exactly that sabotage threat. That same arrangement made them extraordinarily easy for Japanese pilots to strafe and bomb from the air. Rows of aircraft destroyed in single passes that would have scattered far more survivable damage across a dispersed field. The torpedo bombers came in low across the harbor first, releasing modified shallow-running torpedoes specifically adapted for Pearl Harbor's unusually shallow anchorage. A technical problem Japanese naval engineers had spent months solving, specifically because American planners had assumed the harbor was too shallow for a conventional aerial torpedo attack to work at all, an assumption that had shaped years of complacent harbor defense planning right up until the morning it was proven wrong in the space of a few minutes. USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits within the opening minutes and began rolling onto her side, eventually capsizing with hundreds of her crew still trapped below decks in compartments that would not be fully searched for months. USS Arizona, moored nearby, was struck by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her forward decks and detonated in a powder magazine, an explosion so violent it lifted the battleship's bow visibly out of the water and killed more than 1,100 of her crew in a matter of seconds. More than half of all the Americans who would die that morning concentrated in the loss of that single ship alone. A second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived a little after 8:45, continuing the assault on ships and airfields for roughly another hour, concentrating on cruisers, destroyers, and the dry docks and repair facilities that would determine how quickly the fleet could recover. By which point, American anti-aircraft crews, now fully alerted and finally at their stations, were putting up enough concentrated fire that Japanese losses in the second wave were noticeably heavier than in the largely unopposed first pass. Nagumo, aboard his flagship, chose not to launch a planned third wave against the harbor's fuel, storage tanks, and submarine base, a decision that would later be second-guessed by historians who noted those fuel reserves, if destroyed, might have crippled the Pacific Fleet's ability to operate from Hawaii at all for the better part of a year. By the time the last Japanese aircraft turned north to rejoin the carriers, the attack had killed 2,403 Americans, sank or damaged 19 naval vessels, including all 8 of the battleships present in the harbor that morning, and destroyed more than 300 aircraft on the ground and in the air, the overwhelming majority of them without ever having the chance to leave the runway. At almost the exact moment the second wave of Japanese aircraft was breaking off and turning for home over Oahu, 6,000 miles away in Washington, Ambassador Nomura and Envoy Kurusu were finally shown into Secretary Hull's office. It was 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, nearly an hour and a half after their original appointment, and, unknown to either of them, well over 2 hours after the attack itself had begun. President Roosevelt had already been informed of the unfolding reports from Hawaii and had specifically instructed Hull not to reveal what he knew to the 2 waiting diplomats, preferring to let the formal exchange play out as though it were still an ordinary, if unusually tense, diplomatic meeting. Nomura handed over the 14-part document, the formal notice that negotiations had failed, still under the impression he was delivering diplomatic language rather than confirmation of an attack already well underway on the other side of the Pacific. Hull, who had been briefed on the unfolding reports from Hawaii before the 2 men had even been shown into his office, made a show of reading through pages he already understood to be moot, then looked up and told the ambassador, in careful, controlled fury, that colleagues who witnessed it never forgot. that in all his 50 years of public service, he had never seen a document more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that he had never imagined until this day that any government on the planet was capable of uttering them. Nomura and Kurusu left the State Department in stunned silence, still not fully aware of what had already happened on the other side of the Pacific, and would not fully grasp the scale of it until radio bulletins reached them later that same afternoon. Here is where the strange, quiet second half of this story begins, because almost nobody involved in either failure that morning paid for it the way the public record would suggest they should have. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was investigated by multiple inquiries into the disaster over the following years, including congressional hearings that examined his 4-word response in exhaustive detail, and every one of them concluded he had not been meaningfully at fault. An inexperienced officer given a piece of information he had no training to properly interpret, working a job he had held for less than 8 hours in total across 2 shifts. He continued his career in the Air Force for decades afterward, was never disciplined over the call, and lived until he was 96 years old, dying in the year 2010, still occasionally recognized and asked by strangers about the 4 words he had said that morning, words that would follow him through an entire unrelated career and be replayed unflatteringly in films and documentaries he mostly declined to discuss. Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, the 2 privates who had actually seen the blip and pushed to report it, received almost no public recognition for years, their role treated as a minor footnote in the official record until congressional hearings on the attack finally brought their names properly into testimony in 1946, 5 years after the fact. Lockard was eventually awarded a Distinguished Service Medal for his actions that morning, one of the few tangible acknowledgments handed out to anyone on the American side of either failure. Elliott, for his part, spent the rest of his life in New Jersey, rarely discussing what he had seen, telling a local newspaper decades later simply that he had seen the blip and had not known what to make of it, a plain, almost apologetic description of a moment that historians would spend the rest of the century picking apart. Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short, the 2 senior commanders responsible for the Navy and Army at Pearl Harbor that morning, were not so fortunate. Both men were relieved of command within days of the attack, formally blamed by an official inquiry known as the Roberts Commission for Dereliction of Duty, and forced into retirement at reduced permanent rank. Careers that had spanned decades ended within a matter of weeks by a report written before either dust had settled or the full sequence of radar and cryptographic failures had been properly reconstructed. Both men spent the rest of their lives contesting the verdict, and both died before seeing any meaningful reversal of it. It would take until the 21st century, more than 60 years later, for the United States Congress to pass a resolution stating both men had performed their duties competently and with professional skill given the information they had actually been provided, and urging that their full wartime ranks be restored posthumously, an acknowledgement that arrived generations after either man could hear it himself. Ambassador Nomura and Envoy Kurusu were interned in the United States for several months following the attack held at a resort hotel in Hot Springs, Virginia, alongside other Japanese diplomatic staff, and eventually exchanged in the summer of 1942 for American diplomats and prisoners held in Japan, traveling home aboard a neutral exchange vessel. A military tribunal after the war declined to prosecute either man, concluding that both had genuinely been kept in the dark by their own government about the precise timing of an attack. Their own diplomatic mission had been sent, in the strange formal logic of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, to announce just barely after the fact rather than before it. Nomura, once considered one of the more genuinely popular Japanese diplomats in Washington's social circles before the war, returned home to a country in ruins, later became president of a major Japanese electronics firm, and died in Tokyo in 1964, a full 23 years after the appointment. Neither he nor Kurusu had ever been late enough, in the end, to matter. This is not a story about a single missed warning, and it never was. It is a story about a country that built 2 separate systems specifically to prevent this exact morning, staffed both of them with people who did their individual jobs on time and largely without error, and still watched the morning happen anyway because a correct report delivered to the wrong person without the context to make it credible, is functionally indistinguishable from no report at all. The tragedy of December the 7th was never a story of laziness or incompetence, in the way the Roberts Commission's rushed initial verdict implied. It was a story about the specific narrow gap between information existing somewhere in a system and information being believed by the one person positioned to act on it. And that gap, on that particular Sunday morning, happened to be exactly wide enough for a fleet of Japanese carriers to sail through it undetected until it was already too late to matter. The Opana radar site itself is gone now, replaced decades ago by a State Department diplomatic communications facility, though a commemorative marker still stands at the base of the hill where Lockhart and Elliott watched their oscilloscope that morning, a National Historic Landmark visited today mostly by tourists who already know how the story ends before they ever climb the hill. Somewhere in the National Archives, the original magic decrypts still exist. The 14th part of the message and the 1 o'clock delivery instruction that nobody connected to Hawaiian Sunrise in time to matter, filed alongside transcripts of a phone call between two Army privates and a fighter pilot on his second shift, 4 words long, that a country would spend the rest of the century trying to decide how much blame a single sentence could actually carry. USS Arizona still rests where she sank, a memorial built directly across her submerged hull, oil still occasionally rising to the surface from tanks ruptured more than 80 years ago, a slow, visible reminder that some of what happened that morning has never fully finished happening. Every part of the warning arrived somewhere. Almost every individual step taken in isolation was performed correctly and on schedule by privates who stayed past their shift to keep practicing, by cryptographers who worked through the night to finish a translation, by an ambassador who followed his government's instructions to the letter, even as those instructions quietly stopped making sense. The country was still caught completely off guard, not because no one saw it coming, but because seeing it and believing it were never, on that particular morning, allowed to be the same thing. If you want more stories about the moments a war turned on a decision nobody remembers making, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.